The two things that the anti-gun folks have promised that are at the top of their list whenever they say, well, we're not going to take anybody's guns, they're obviously telling an untruth. They are going to take your guns. They do want to take your guns. They want to take your high capacity magazines.
We are the Armed Attorneys. Today we're talking about there's kind of a lot of, it seems like 2A news. It goes kind of slow and then there's a whole lot all at once. So we have three important issues that we're talking about today. You're going to want to hear about all of them. We're talking post offices, we're talking magazine bans, and we're talking about public housing. So we have a lot of things to cover. But before we begin, show your support for the Second Amendment by hitting that like button. And I think we should start with this incredible case out of the state of New York.
Yeah, the state of New York, which is the Second Circuit, which obviously New York, the Second Circuit, a very left leaning circuit, but there was a circuit judge that agreed that prohibit just a blanket prohibition of firearms in public housing was a violation of the Constitution.
Yeah, that's incredible. So they issued a permanent injunction. This is not a temporary restraining order. This is not a preliminary injunction. This is a permanent injunction out of what we typically think of a hostile jurisdiction to the Second Amendment. And why this one, hits close to home. I hate the way that renters, public housing people, homeowners, they are all treated differently. Homeowners, you don't get kicked out of your house whenever you defend yourself. But I've seen this happen time and time again. Renters, people in, trailers, they rent, a lot or whatever. They lose their housing because they defend themselves. And I just hate this desperate treatment.
Oh yeah, and the thing about it is if we
Also, public housing is super dangerous, so you should probably be armed.
public housing, if there is really any place a law-abiding American citizen needs to have the full ability to protect themselves, I'm afraid it's going to be in public housing.
Yeah, think about, you don't think of public transit as being the bastion of safety and security. Public housing, oftentimes, tragically, it's the same case. If there's any place that you want to be able to defend yourself, it's that.
And keep in mind, illegal conduct with a firearm is still illegal. So many people in the anti-gun world, they believe that if somebody's lawfully allowed to possess, then somehow that translates into them being lawfully allowed to use. No, if you still are a prohibited person, if you still misuse your firearm, if you still use a firearm to commit a crime, all still crimes. All we're dealing with is the ability of a lawful citizen to lawfully protect themselves from the bad guy.
Yeah, so if you want to check that out, that's Hunter v. Courtland Housing Authority. I wanted to read one quote from the judge in their order. It's fantastic. Pursuant to the plaintiff's claims as set forth in the First Amendment complaint, defendants and their respective employees, agents, representatives, service providers, and/or contractors are enjoined from prohibiting plaintiffs and all CHA tenants from owning, possessing, transporting, or using firearms for lawful purposes, provided that they are otherwise qualified and in compliance with all other federal, state, and local laws applicable to ownership, possession, transportation, and use of firearms. That's Judge Sotheby. And so, that's a huge win.
Yes, but keep in mind, for those of you who are watching who may be in public housing, who may want to, this is very specific to only this particular housing authority. So it doesn't even apply to all housing authorities in the state of New York, especially doesn't apply to every housing authority in the United States entirely. But this is the first step. This is how we get this freedom on a national level, is it's got to go through the district court, then the circuit court, then perhaps ultimately the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So this is the first step, but technically this particular ruling only affects those folks who live in a unit governed by that particular housing authority.
And that's how it starts. District courts, their opinions not binding on anyone else, typically used as persuasive authority. If this thing gets appealed by the government, then maybe this becomes more wide-reaching. But I wanted to move to this post office carry ban. Generally, we have, this is from the Firearms Policy Coalition, another really important case. If you want to check this out, 424 CV 00565, Firearms Policy Coalition versus Merrick Garland. This and its corresponding Code of Federal Regulation provision. We're talking about carry bans in post office. Think, if it's a standalone post office, this is going to include the grounds, sidewalks, parking lots around it. If it's leased by a post office, think you have a strip center and you just have a post office as one tenant inside of the larger unit. We're talking about just that building itself. But this is a challenge on the ban in those locations.
Yeah, because whenever you go to the post office, if you're interested, there's actually two bans that you have to be aware of. It's an act of disorderly conduct to have a firearm, including in your automobile.
That's wild.
On the in the parking lot, sidewalks, walkways of the post office, and then there's a separate law that actually criminalizes taking a firearm into a federal facility, a federal building, and that's the biggie. That gets you. And of course, what's interesting about this is that whenever it gets down to the court, kind of analyzing the history, text, tradition, we have a direct comparison because, ironically enough, the same document that created the post office also created, ultimately, through amendment, the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
And so surely the argument could be, look, if the Founding Fathers wanted to prohibit taking a firearm into the post office, they probably would have written it right there in the Constitution when they gave Congress the authority to create the post office.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. In this case, this is filed in Texas. Again, we've had lots of great decisions coming out of the state of Texas, and these have been moving their way up to the Fifth Circuit. Some of these are having nationwide impacts. This is a fantastic case. I imagine we'll keep our eye on it. It's very, very early in the stages of all of this. But ultimately, disorderly stamp collecting, what are they going for?
And remember, years ago, we had that singular post office in Colorado where the courts had determined that was not going to be a gun-free zone. And
yeah.
Of course, it threw everybody into I wouldn't say, they didn't throw them into a panic, but it certainly opened the doors for people to then assume, post offices are now, no longer gun-free places. That case did not have the ability to do that. However, this one does, assuming that it goes through the district court, circuit court, ultimately perhaps even to the Supreme Court. This one could ultimately decide whether or not every post office loses its gun-free status.
Yeah, and Edwin already gave us the text and history, but we're looking at this through the Bruin lens. Hey, is the Second Amendment implicated? Yes, presumptively unconstitutional. Clearly, there's not support for this, so we'll see where this goes, and we'll keep you updated. Now, the third case that we wanted to talk about came out of the D.C. Circuit, and this was probably one of the more troubling things we've seen in a while.
Oh, yeah. No. This is definitely the biggie. So recently, a panel of the D.C. Circuit, the federal appeals court for the District of Columbia, upheld in a 2-1 decision, upheld the D.C. Ban on magazines over 10 rounds, what the anti-gun folks like to call high-capacity magazines, which we in the real world who actually own and possess and use magazines simply call a standard capacity magazine. So this is going to be very interesting because it held that, and it tried to do all the new Bruin analysis. It held that having a ban on magazines that were over 10 rounds is not unconstitutional. It does not violate your Second Amendment rights.
Yeah. And so unlike other magazine ban cases we've seen across the United States, we've seen courts try to completely avoid doing a New York State Rifle and Pistol Association analysis by saying, hey, guess what? The Second Amendment is not implicated by insert accessory here. In this case, magazines. We've seen those. This one is a little bit different. They do say the Second Amendment is implicated. However, they somehow justify this. I mean, it should be unconstitutional. Come on, government, give us a ton of evidence of why this is okay. What do they say?
Well, and that's where the one judge who did not agree with the other two said, he was like, look, once we determine that the Second Amendment is implicated, then this regulation is unconstitutional. The other side said no, they did have a right, the state does have a right to do this. What the panel seemed to look at was, of course, DC's argument is that they're not taking away your right to have a firearm, but what they're doing is they're simply trying to eliminate or mitigate the mass carnage that a high capacity magazine could create. And in fact, they kind of point to this when they say that in their opinion, although these laws may target different crimes than does the magazine capacity, that's whenever they're looking at other laws that they were arguing would fit into the tradition of regulating firearms, then does the magazine cap. They share the same basic purpose: to inhibit then unprecedentedly lethal criminal activity by restricting or banning weapons that are particularly susceptible to and were widely used for multiple homicides and mass injuries, the panel wrote. And so that is what is most troubling about this, because the two things that the anti-gun folks have promised that are at the top of their list whenever they say, well, we're not going to take anybody's guns, they're obviously telling an untruth. They are going to take your guns. They do want to take your guns. They want to take your high capacity magazines. They have promised the two things on their hit list at the top of it. They want to reinstitute their ban on assault weapons, which are really just semi-automatic firearms. You'll be shocked at the list of firearms, shotguns, handguns, and rifles that fall under the definition of assault weapons. And they want to limit your magazine capacities, which every single person out there who owns any semi-automatic handguns, unless you're a collector of exclusively 1911s, you have a magazine that is greater than 10 rounds. I almost guarantee it. If you have multiple semi-automatic handguns, you're going to have a magazine that's affected by this. Because even though we're just talking about DC, keep in mind DC, obviously the home of the federal government, and that they have repeatedly said, and they are not shy about it, magazine capacities is one of their number one targets. And so, yeah, if a magazine, if this court decision stands, which hopefully it won't, hopefully it will immediately go to the Supreme Court, they want to come take away your magazines. They want to restrict your magazines. In fact, I believe a certain presidential candidate who has bragged about having a Glock in the glove compartment of what I assume to be perhaps a Miata.
No, it's definitely a Prius.
A Prius, perhaps, yes. Definitely not a Tesla.
No,
not at this point. Who famously has bragged about keeping a particular handgun in that glove compartment of that automobile. I can almost guarantee that magazine is in violation of the DC magazine law. And I'm here right now calling for a federal investigation. If this person has admitted being in violation of the DC law, they should be investigated.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing on the court's opinion there, I don't find it super persuasive. It's like hey, if we just threw everybody in a cage and locked them up and threw them in jail, then there wouldn't be any more crime. It's the same logic. It doesn't make sense to me, but we had a lot of different stories, covered a lot of ground, but we hope you enjoy this discussion. If you did, consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and help us fight the anti-2A algorithm by sharing this video. And always question and comment down below. And until next time, we're the Armed Attorneys.